You know, things are getting decidedly difficult for the Democrats in the presidential election race. Not only are they falling actually substantially behind Donald Trump in all of the swing state contests, not only are they falling behind on the national opinion polling, but they have dug out the corpse of Russiagate, the discredited husk of the Russiagate allegations from 2016 and 2020. They have disinterred the bones of the idea that the Russians are conducting active measures on a massive scale to influence the outcome of the election. The fact that the President of the United States, for the 16th straight day, is on a deck chair on a beach in Delaware, while international crises multiply and deepen. The fact that cackling Kamala Harris, the next in charge, is on the campaign trail and not, as was said by AOC, devoting endless hours and sleepless nights to bringing about a ceasefire in the Middle East. The fact that the inflation rate in the United States for groceries is some 25% in the period of the Biden-Harris administration. The fact that the United States is riven with social, cultural, racial malaise, such as the malaise of massacring children in their schools on an almost monthly, sometimes weekly basis. These are all apparently the result of Russian interference. The fact that AIPAC, a foreign agent organization, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has just announced that its spending in the current electoral cycle has passed $100 million. Now there's election interference, and they boast that every single candidate that they supported with that $100 million was successful in their primary race. Now that's what I call election interference. Hunter Biden's laptop may not, as it turned out, have been Russian disinformation, but stand by, they're on the hunt for more. They're raiding houses with the FBI, armed officers of journalists who've had the temerity to work in the past on Russian media platforms. I think that the desperation in this new turn in the US presidential election will be forlorn, because it seems to me, if ever a party looked like a corpse, it's Joe Biden's Democratic Party of the United States of America. And Trump appears to have found his mojo. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. coming on board seems to me like a game changer. But we'll be discussing this and much more with some of the best guests you can imagine in the course of this show. The active shooting at cities and civilians in Russia is indisputable. No one can dispute that the ordinance involved was made in England. In fact, the Russian Foreign Affairs spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, today identified the precise two factories in Newport, in Wales, where the munitions were constructed. The fact that the software on the munitions, on the drones that are killing civilians in their cars, in their gardens, in their shops, in Russian cities, was programmed, apparently, according to her, by British programmers, means that Britain has gone to war. I predicted that Keir Starmer would take Britain into war within 6 months of achieving office, and so exactly he did. Within 6 months, we entered the war, not just in Ukraine, we entered that a long time ago, but the war in Russia itself. The Russian foreign minister has stated publicly that Russia considers Britain to be equally culpable for these civilian deaths caused in the Russian cities by long-range weaponry supplied by Britain and by drone technology programmed by Britain. They now regard the Zelensky regime and the British government as co-responsible for those deaths. They say that there will be a reckoning, but that the algorithm for the nature of that reckoning is still in play, and that in any case it would plainly not be in their interest to announce it. So brace yourselves, Britain. Our government has taken us to war with a hypersonically nuclear-capable state, which is winning its war with NATO and is ready for a reckoning with some NATO partners, with Britain now preeminent amongst them. British Parliament was never consulted, never mind informed of this turn of events, and frankly, not many British members of Parliament would have been interested in participating in the discussion if there had been. But the British people and our legitimate interests abroad may very well now be adversely affected in the extreme. But the war's going very badly for NATO. The Russian front against the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass is now proceeding at such a pace it is frankly impossible to keep up, never mind learn how to pronounce the names of the towns and the villages that are falling, not just daily now, but hourly. There is a full-scale Pell, mell scramble of Ukrainian forces in retreat in the face of this Russian advance. The writing is on the wall, not just on the front, but in the home fires that are now beginning to consume the Zelensky administration. Half of Zelensky's cabinet resigned today. Members of Parliament are beginning to resign. The dogs of war in the Ministry of Defense, rogue officers, rogue former defense ministers are beginning to circle Zelensky. When a war begins to go wrong, there are not many who will remain absolutely loyal to the person that took them into the war. People begin to calculate of their own best interests, sometimes even the nation's best interests, in what should be done next. So NATO, in desperation, is supporting what are essentially terrorist acts. They would be terrorist acts if they were taking place at the hand of anyone else and anywhere else, and they are terrorist acts when they kill old ladies in their gardens in Russian cities. Imagine weaponry costing tens, scores, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars is being expended on killing shoppers in Russian cities you've never heard of before. In no conceivable military universe can any of this make any difference at all to the outcome of the war. As a matter of fact, the inverse proportion has now begun to work. The more effort that's put into terrorist acts on Russia, the more the Russians advance against the NATO-backed Zelensky army in the Ukraine. And it may not stop where it once might have stopped. The chronology of this is important. As I argued heavily at the time, if the Minsk agreements, the second Minsk agreement, guaranteed by Germany and France, and then later by the Security Council of the United Nations, if the Minsk agreement had been implemented, 100% of the national territory of Ukraine would remain part of the national territory of Ukraine. There would have been no war, no invasion. If the Minsk agreements had been genuine and acted upon, there would be no Ukrainian war. There would have been no blowing up of the Nord Stream. There would have been no disaster in the German economy. There would have been no rise of the AfD in the regional elections in Germany. European gas prices would be a half or less than half of what they are. There would have been no war, no casualties, no crisis that takes us to the brink of World War III. But the Minsk agreements were a deception. It is now clear. They were never meant to be implemented. So the invasion happened. And then there were talks in Istanbul, and an agreement was reached between Russia and the Zelensky regime. In Kiev, their negotiators initialed a peace agreement, which would have been more than Minsk II, but way, way, way less than where we are now. Boris Johnson was ordered by the American government to go and tell Zelensky that up with that, NATO would not put, and that no such agreement could be concluded. And so the war went on. And trillions of your tax dollars, pounds and euros, were spent. Nord Stream was destroyed. Germany plunged into cold and deindustrialized, increasing poverty and national division, even chaos on the streets of Germany, and the rise of radical political parties that would have had no look in at all in the German political scene if it were not for this war in Ukraine. Think about that. And then Moscow offered over and over again peace talks. And those peace talks would have taken place with the Russian armies hundreds of kilometers back towards Russia than they currently sit. And so, as the war dragged on, and the terrorist campaign in the Kursk Battle of the Bulge and other attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Russia, if that had not taken place, then a negotiated settlement might have been able to be reached that would have been far more advantageous. But now, why would Russia negotiate at all with Zelensky? If Zelensky is overthrown and a new government emerges that is serious about denazification, denatoization, and a recognition that the old Ukraine is gone for good, maybe this war can still be brought to a conclusion in a way that does not entail the effective end of a Ukrainian state altogether. But now the Russian war aims are bound to be expanding, bound to be increasing, and any agreement will be far more disadvantageous to Ukrainian nationalists, to the Zelensky comprador, and to their NATO armorers and financiers. But we'll talk to Che Bose, one of the best informed men. I was going to call him an Englishman, but of course he's an Irishman. But in English language terms, he's by far and away the best informed analyst of what's happening in Russia and in Ukraine, anywhere to be found. But let me turn to the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. Israel murdered their own hostages again in Gaza. You must know that because the faces of the hostages have been on the television screens ever since. They've been on the front page of all of your newspapers ever since. Of course, neither the television nor the newspapers tell you that Israel killed those hostages. They repeat the Israeli lie that the Palestinian resistance murdered those hostages. Well, neither you nor I were there, but it strikes me as simply bonkers to imagine that Hamas would kill hostages who are worth more than their weight in gold in transactional terms in exchange for Palestinian hostages held by Israel. But we weren't there. We don't know what happened. But what we do know, and it's being told to us by some of the most senior Israelis in the land, that Netanyahu does not now and never has had any interest in freeing those hostages. First, because he won't pay the price. They paid 1,000 prisoners for Gilad Shalit, 1,000 political prisoners for one man, but they are not prepared to release the list of Palestinian hostages including high-value hostages like Marwan Barghouti. They are not prepared to release those hostages back into the legitimate political sphere, but mainly because the goal never had anything to do with freeing hostages. It had everything to do with continuing the genocidal onslaught, which will not end, if he can achieve it, until every last Palestinian has been removed from Gaza or otherwise extirpated, annihilated, destroyed, their blood draining into the forlorn sand of the Gaza Strip. That's the game. That's the goal. And they have fallen so far short of it that it's difficult to see how Netanyahu, having waded thus far into this river of blood, can decide whether to go on or whether to go back. If he goes back, it's the end for Netanyahu and a probable prison term as a result. And so on he wades, and no one from amongst the plethora of politicians in Western countries who've paid for the whole thing, who've covered for the whole thing diplomatically, who've shilled for the whole thing in every corridor of the mass media world, there's no sign that any Western politician is prepared to force Netanyahu to stop wading through the blood of the Palestinian people. Iran has not spoken yet. But it may speak tonight. It may speak tomorrow night or on Sunday. Who knows? But that Iran will speak seems impossible to doubt. The Iranian state's prestige, the Islamic Republic's honor, requires a response to the egregious mass murder in Gaza, mass murder in Lebanon, and the proximate reason, the cold-blooded murder of a special guest of the Islamic Republic, Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of the Palestinian negotiating team with Israel in these hostage matters of which I have spoken. So when Iran speaks, does the balloon go up? And if it goes up, who tries to shoot it down? And what role will the Western governments, having had a beating in Ukraine, want to play in the Persian Gulf and in the Levant? On that subject, we're about to speak to Ghadi Francis, author, journalist, and war correspondent, and one of our most popular guests ever here on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night because it is the Mother of All Talk Shows.